Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and it's monk time. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so I'm sitting in the Fat Cave, working at the forge, trying to whip up a tasty Halloween treat when the gatekeepers decided to throw me one of their own. So while trying not to spoil the episode that I'm working on, I'd like to introduce you to Matthew Monk Lewis. And he's one of those romantic, poetry, playwriting, novelist types associated with the juice and the radical political movement that he and all his publisher friends are all about. And he has a fairly interesting upbringing story. He's raised with privilege, of course, because his father simultaneously held two different salaried positions within the War Department. And allegedly, he was the first person to do that. And his family also owns 6 sugar plantations in Jamaica, making him the owner of quite the indentured workforce, if you know what I mean. And so Monk is well educated, right? And he loves all things romantic. And he goes on to translate many different French and German works into English, right? He's also involved in the London Theatre District and goes on to represent Hindon in Parliament. And this is amazing because not only was Hindon in Wiltshire, home of places like Stonehenge and Silbury Hill, it's also where pervy Mervyn Touchet got up to all his buggery. And Hindon was also a corrupt, rotten borough, whose parliament seats were grandfathered in by royal charter, even though by the late 1700s, the rotten boroughs, as they were called, were too small to earn a parliament seat of their own. Much like nearby Old Sarum, also in Wiltshire, Old Sarum had 2 parliament seats, yet it was uninhabited. How does that work? Right, so the Reform Act of 1832 takes care of all these little problems, but maybe the most interesting thing about Monk here is how he earned his nickname. Right, when he was 21, he publishes the work that would make him famous, or, at the very least, infamous. Right, and it was titled, naturally, The Monk. And it was an early novel of Gothic horror that predates Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by some 20 plus years. And, like the modern Prometheus after it, it was first published anonymously. Which of course throws up flags for me, makes me think that the Royal Society or one of its offshoot clubs like the Philosophical Breakfast Club published this thing anonymously and then, when it was successful, assigned it authorship later. And the story of the monk is a convoluted tale of twisted moral depravity that sees a pious monk fall victim to the temptations of sin, ultimately ending up a rapist and a murderer who sells his soul to the devil. And this is contemporary with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, which I always thought was an older work, but it wasn't published in its entirety until 1806, some 10 years after The Monk. And this is interesting because the two men were friends, bonding over German translations into English, right? And so perhaps this could demonstrate some complicity between these romantic Gothic writers to introduce tropes like selling your soul to the devil into multiple cultures simultaneously. And of course, the book was totally scandalous and extremely successful, cementing Monk Lewis's place in literary Gothic horror history. And so naturally, I wanted to take a look at who published The Monk, especially now that I'm trying to get back into my Publishers Clearinghouse eventually, because it just had to be one of our usual suspects, right? Wrong. Right, here's the title page to the first edition, and it says that it was printed for J. Saunders under the heading Waterford. And now neither of these names was familiar to me, and so a quick search for a Waterford publishing house got me nothing, right? But in my reading on the history of publishing, I know that the words printed for didn't necessarily mean that's who published or printed the book. It oftentimes does, but it could also just be the person who paid for its publishing, kind of like a vanity thing. And so, of course, having never heard of J. Saunders, I wanted to find out what I could about him, and that's when the gatekeepers gave me their early Halloween treat, elevating Monk Lewis in his novel from a one-slide mention to the star of his very own, albeit brief, video. Because when I Googled J. Saunders, publisher of The Monk, the first thing that it showed me was this wiki page for one John Monk Saunders. And I saw that and I was like, wait a minute, what? American novelist, screenwriter, and film director, born November 22nd, which is a 33, and he died on March 11th, which is another 33. And I thought, like, nope, there's nothing to see here, right? And so it turns out that John Monk Saunders, who gets the name Monk from his mother's side of the family, and the gatekeepers are quiet about his parents, but he's born in Minnesota, home of the American Viking, before the family relocates out to Seattle, Washington, where he attends the famous Broadway High School, which is the first dedicated high school building in Seattle. And he graduates from the University of Washington, and after an illustrious career as a collegiate athlete and flight instructor for World War I pilots, decides to take up writing, and he's so good at it that a Hollywood producer options an unfinished novel of his and turns it into the very first movie to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. It was a movie called Wings, and it was released in 1927. And here's a picture of Johnny Monk in 1930 with his wife, Fay Ray. And he would have been married to her when she was making King Kong, one of, if not the, greatest monster movies of all time. Right? I've lost track of how many movie monsters this story has hit upon. And this relationship makes me curious as to just how involved John Monk Saunders could have been in the making of King Kong. And in this year, 1930, he wins an Oscar of his very own for writing The Dawn Patrol, another World War I propaganda piece set in the skies. And so if all of this success and the name thing weren't enough to tingle the old fat senses, what he says while accepting his Oscar for Dawn Patrol sent my apophenia running wild. Right? He says that this indeed is a crazy business where I'm being sued for plagiarism on one hand and given the statuette for originality on the other. And so I don't know anything about this plagiarism accusation he's talking about here. But you know who struggled against allegations of plagiarism? That's right, Monk Lewis did. You see, he used to openly admit to incorporating others' ideas into his work, which drew praise from some and criticism from others, like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who argued that by divulging his inspiration, Lewis surrendered authorship. Because I'm sure Coleridge never borrowed an idea, right? Certainly not with the name Taylor in there. And Coleridge also warns that The Monk was a book which, if a parent saw in the hands of a son or daughter, he might reasonably turn pale, right? But regardless, I find all of these coincidences, being able to connect Matthew Monk Lewis and John Monk Saunders, who The Monk was originally printed for in 1796, is really amazing, and another crazy addition to the Mud City Paradigm puzzle tree, which has me seeing resemblances between the two men, adding a little certain Mud City je ne sais quoi to this whole thing, right? It's all part of the code, because to top this one off with a cherry, when you put J. Saunders into a gematria calculator, it equals 666 in English gematria, the number of the beast. And it makes me wonder who J. Saunders could have really been.
Could it be Satan?
All right, so that's all I have for this one. I could have gone a lot deeper. There are plenty of interesting names around Monk Lewis, so I don't think Mud City is done with him. And at the very least, he's going to make a cameo in the next episode, which I need to get cracking on if I hope to have it up by Halloween. All right, so remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? So until the next one, cheers.